Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping national security and defense. It's Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. On today's episode, Dr. Stéfanie von Hlatky discusses the upcoming 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 with Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill. They'll explore the progress, challenges, and the future of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. This is the Expert Series.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Stéfanie von Hlatky, proud board member with the CDA Institute and a professor of political studies at Queen's University. I'm delighted to guest host this episode of the Expert Series podcast featuring Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Jacqueline O'Neill. Our listeners might be familiar with her work, as Ambassador O'Neill was the 2023 Vimy Award recipient. And I'll start by saying that 2025 will also be a big year for Ambassador O'Neill, a busy year, as it is the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which was launched with the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in the year 2000. So we'll dive right in and focus right away on this important milestone for women, peace, and security. Ambassador O'Neill, welcome to the podcast, and perhaps you can provide us with an overview of what's on the horizon for this major anniversary.
Thanks, Stephanie, and hi to the whole CDA Institute community. It is a big year coming up. It seems like every year is a big year these days. As you mentioned, it's the 25th anniversary of this Women, Peace and Security agenda, as we call it. And there's been a lot of reflection in the last months, even years, about how are we going to think about this anniversary? What's the tone that advocates like myself and others want to take and share about this? And I'd say we've kind of landed on a space where it's not a full celebration, because there are a lot of gaps in implementation and a lot of places where the vision is certainly not realized. We're seeing, dramatic increases in conflict around the world and a lot of decline in some of the key areas that we've been trying to make progress in. We can come back to that, but we're trying to find, I would say, a thoughtful balance between calling out these big gaps in resourcing and funding to actually implement some of this work, and accountability to make sure that when people are not living up to commitments they've said, that's noted and there are consequences, and in real integration across other areas of focus. So we don't want to just have policies about women's inclusion and then have them not reflected in other elements. So calling out those gaps, but then also very much calling people in to this work and this agenda. And by that, of course, I mean making sure that men see the relevance of this work, that they see themselves as key actors and key sources of leadership in this area, that they themselves are advocates, that we have people in communities all around the world advocating for this issue. And so calling people in means also sharing positive stories, sharing examples of the very specific benefits that occur to communities, to armed forces, to governments, the financial benefits, all sorts of positive aspects of this. And so it's a bit of a balancing act. And anniversaries, and I don't always love anniversaries in and of themselves, but they're action forcing events. And so we have a lot of Canadian embassies around the world who are working with the governments where they're based and already started to have conversations about what can we do to mark this upcoming 25th important year. And so I think a really key message is, one, the balance on tone, and two, focus on implementation. Really look at resourcing, really look at, are we integrating the stuff, as opposed to simply issuing positive statements or declarations of how important the work is.
I really like this theme of calling out and calling in. And even though we might feel ambiguous about the overall bilan of women, peace, and security over the last 25 years. The academic literature on women, peace, and security does show that around these anniversaries, there's more mobilization. It's called the anniversary effect, and governments and international organizations tend to do more. So that's a positive. I wanted to also talk about the fact that the women, peace, and security agenda as a series of norms to increase the representation and participation of women across the conflict resolution spectrum is increasingly being contested. And so I wanted to talk about the rise in anti-feminist, anti-gender rhetoric that we see everywhere and how you've approached this in your work.
Thanks for naming that. As you referenced, it's something that we see all around the world. It's not unique to any one region or place. And it's an area of advocacy for some, I guess, a area that they're calling attention to that is growing in strength. And so a few of the things that we're seeing, just to break down what we're seeing and then talk a bit about how to respond to it. I mean, first, we're seeing some countries, Russia lead among them, are perpetuating a false notion that the idea of gender equality, or very specifically, this concept of women, peace, and security, is created by the West and imposed on the rest. That it denies the fact that this agenda came from women in communities all around the world in every continent. That's how it got to the United Nations. That's how it came to countries, as women at really deep community levels brought it upwards. And they're trying to, I think, divide a lot of traditional alliances by and separating and increasing this global North, global South divide. So that's one fact. We're seeing increasing amounts of disinformation campaigns and online attacks that are truly aimed at getting women out of public life. We're seeing them being supported by authoritarian regimes, working very closely with, as they say, bot farms or other artificial intelligence generators, really to target individual women and to prevent them from having an influence in all kinds of processes, including ones related to peace and security. And this anti-gender movement, which is often trying to rupture our societies based on what they see as fault lines. So looking at possible stereotypes or areas where there are some differences in people's opinions, but that don't necessarily have to divide communities so deeply. They're getting very well financed. They're getting organized and coordinated across boundaries, across borders. And we really have to see this as a very specific threat. So what do we do to respond? A few things. One, we have to keep sharing positive, clear examples of this work and the impacts of this work. We have to take it out of terms like gender ideology. We have to really make it accessible. We have to talk about why it matters for women to be able to have a right to decide their role in a country. So we have to talk in really clear, accessible language. We have to really emphasize and profile the leadership on WPS that we've seen around the world. So many people sort of assume that leadership on women, peace, and security or gender equality comes from Canada or comes from the Nordic countries, et cetera. But there's a deep, deep history in Bangladesh, for example. The Philippines. The Philippines was the first country that ever had a woman negotiate a peace agreement and sign a peace agreement with a rebel group. Namibia was a country that brought this work to the UN. So we have to keep reminding people of the history of this work and highlighting ways that countries and people all around the world are innovating in this. We're trying to discourage new negotiated text at multilateral institutions. That's where a lot of this fighting kind of plays out. And we have a lot of diplomats who have to spend a lot of time trying to get language not erased or inserted in different texts that doesn't really, really affect people's lives. And so we're really trying to focus on making sure that where it needs to be integrated in conversations on artificial intelligence, for example, or on climate change, that attention is integrated in those topics and that we're not debating theories as much as we can. And then finally, we also just need to call it out. We have to call out when there's false statements. We have to call out and name who is paying and who is supporting and where some of these messages are coming from, and to really recognize that this is a threat to our own security, our own national security, when we have these forces that are trying to decrease the amount to which our own populations participate in our democratic societies.
Okay, I see the theme of calling out and calling and playing out here again. And so I notice in terms of strategies, maybe to overcome this, a big emphasis on education and raising awareness. And you've also highlighted a few dynamics playing out in diplomatic circles. When we are thinking about Canadians right here at home, what is it that they could be doing to counter disinformation, or even what NATO and its new women, peace, and security policy has called technology facilitated gender based violence?
Again, great question. Because it is in all of our homes, where it's in all of our hands much of the time in our smartphones. Few things I'd say. One is talking to kids about this stuff. And I keep hearing from people that we have to talk with kids about it, even younger kids at younger ages even than we might think. Talking to kids about critical thinking. When you see a video, when you get a message, when someone is talking negatively about something or really positively about something else, who benefits from that? What motivations might they have from doing that? And trying to a little bit of media literacy, right? So a colleague was saying the other day that he was speaking with a class of grade 5 kids about, being online and the experiences of being online. And he said, how do you check if something is accurate or not? How do you know if it's real? And he was saying that most of the kids said, well, we look, if we're on TikTok, we see how many likes something gets. And if we want to cross check, we go to Facebook. And if it's on Facebook too, then it's probably more likely to be real. And so talking to kids about really understanding what sources you can have more trust in and less trust in. And also just talking about respectful discourse and respecting other people online. I think we can never have those conversations too early. I think we need to talk to our elected representatives about how we think Canada should address this, what expectations we want Canadians to have, and what expectations we have of technology and social media platforms. I think we need to think about this as a public problem, not a private problem. So, for example, our Governor General talks about Mary Simon. She talks about how when she was appointed, she faced a lot of attacks online, as she says, on three major kind of aspects. One, racism as an Indigenous woman, sexism as a woman, and ageism, as she says, as someone in her 80s. And she says, I accept criticism, but it was exceptionally hostile. It was being amplified and reiterated, and it was exceptionally personal and hostile. And she said, for a while at the beginning, I thought it was my problem. It was a private problem. It's for me to have tough, broad shoulders to bear. But then she started to realize other young people, men and women, boys and girls, are seeing this and are probably it's shaping their thoughts about her role and who she is and whether they want to play a role in public service, and all kinds of other ways that it affects our Canadians' credibility, our sense of credibility of our institutions. So if it's happening to you, don't think of it as something that you alone need to bear. There are resources and there are some organizations now and networks that are set up to support individuals to address this. And I think the last thing I'd say on this to Canadians is recognizing that employers also need to be thinking about the way that their employees either are or might be targeted online with gender-based violence or disinformation. And we see a lot of employers trying to do the right thing and trying to respond, but sometimes playing into the playbook of those who are trying to attack individuals. And so I I'd have a conversation within your organizations about what do you expect from your employers if you're a boss or a manager. How will you respond? What will your company's social media do when you start to see attacks online at some of your employees specifically, and how will you think about that?
Okay, thank you. I want to continue on this theme of respect online because social media is part of your job. It's how you communicate a lot of the initiatives that you spearhead, but it can be a pretty hostile place, as you've just mentioned, with the stories that were shared by the Governor General. And I think an especially hostile place for women. We know this. So, have you encountered some of this hostility in your day to day work, or maybe broader pushback tied to your position as Canada's ambassador for women, peace, and security?
Yes. I think pretty much any person, first of all, working on issues related to women or gender equality who goes online in any way, shape, or form gets pushback and gets resistance. And I'd say the vast majority of the time, it's not about the issues or the ideas being put forward. It's about your looks, your background, your physical characteristics, and perpetuating a lot of really negative stereotypes. As you said, I do try to be online. I view sharing information with Canadians in particular about what my job is, why I have it, what we're doing, why I'm traveling, what I'm doing when I'm somewhere, what we heard, who we met with. I think it's an important form of accountability. I think you have a right to know what your ambassador for women, peace, and security is doing and hearing. And so we want to communicate. And as you said, every time you try to do so, there's a lot of reaction and a lot of people who want to use any public statement as an opportunity to advance some other set of ideas. A lot of it's really hostile and a lot of it's targeted. And again, everyone tells you don't read the comments, but sometimes you just can't help it. And I am a straight, white, middle class woman, and this is what I get. So I know that what racialized Canadians, racialized women, Indigenous women, for example, in particular, members of LGBTQ plus communities get is compounded many times over.
Oh, I hope that you have a strong support network around you as you encounter some of this hostility and apply some of the strategies you shared with us in terms of countering that attention. But I'm wondering also, do you have some counterparts? I'm wondering how, what the scope of the position of Women, Peace, and Security Ambassador might be in the other countries. I know that other countries have Women, Peace, and Security envoys. So, what does that community look like? And I suppose you support each other through this.
We do, and it includes a number of men. I'll emphasize that there are countries that have a special envoy for women, peace, and security who is a man, which I think is excellent and important in its own ways. Um, Overall, there are about 110 countries in the world right now that have a national strategy or action plan on women, peace, and security. A subset of them have a position similar to mine or something that's loosely aligned with my mandate. And we really do try to work together. And one of the best things about this community is that it's really diverse. So, as I said, it includes countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia. And it's based on the shared goal. It's not necessarily based only on our geographies or us having joined some similar network, 30 or 40 years ago. So we do coordinate, we do collaborate, and sometimes just the solidarity of knowing that people are dealing with similar things is very helpful. And, in this extremely wonderful job that I'm totally privileged to have, I do get to travel a fair amount to different parts of the world. And what I hear from women in communities is remarkably similar. The issues and the challenges that they're facing are remarkably similar across geographies, even when they're in very different contexts and come from very different cultures. So there's certainly a lot to be learned from sharing some of these experiences.
you provide a few examples? That's really interesting because again, there's this attempt to divide and to polarize and emphasize difference and how we may approach this. So I'm intrigued by this idea that fundamentally across different regions there could be this commonality in the way that the women, peace, and security agenda is interpreted.
The single most basic common issue and point that women raise is the fact that they are still primary caregivers in their communities. And that's the same in Canada, it's the same in every part of the world. That on the whole, on average, women still have the majority of caregiving responsibilities for kids and increasingly for older family members. And so that affects the amount of time they have in a day that they can devote to their jobs outside of the home, that they can devote to, um, you know, being an informed member of a community, whether or not they can join an armed force or a police force, whether or not, if they're a member of those, they can go on deployments for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Childcare, in particular, is probably the single most connective tissue. Not saying just women's role as mothers, but the ongoing responsibility that women have within family structures still tends to be a very significant factor in the life choices and professional choices that women make. And so there are a lot of ways that that affects security. We can go into different aspects of it, but uh, in every single place on earth, that's the first thing that women talk about as a factor in their decision making.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk more about this comparison between different countries. I think that's a very interesting angle, and I'll maybe note for our listeners that we're recording this during the week of November 28th. So, right after the meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Montreal, and you're just traveling back from Montreal. So, I was hoping we could debrief a little because you participated in some of those deliberations. So, we'll leave the protests aside, but can you explain why it's so important to engage parliamentarians to advance women, peace, and security?
It's important to engage parliamentarians on almost everything, I would argue, because they are, this is the fundamental essence of democracy. And so we have parliamentarians' role is to represent people to institutions like NATO. And they also have a role in trying to communicate back to the people that they represent about some of the values of being part of membership or an organization like NATO. So we talked a lot about in Montreal this time, and for many years with and through NATO, about roles that parliamentarians can play in advancing this work. So parliamentarians, of course, hold governments accountable. They provide an oversight function, and many of the members of the Parliamentary Assembly that were in Montreal are also members of national committees in their own countries, committees focused on national security, on intelligence, on counterterrorism, on all sorts of other issues that are really relevant to the agenda of women, peace, and security. And so we talked about the roles of parliamentarians in asking questions to witnesses from the government who appear before their committee. How are you living up to your country's commitments? What kind of resources are you dedicating? How are you holding, what are you tracking? Are you collecting information that's disaggregated by data? So, do you understand how many women you're recruiting? How many men? How many women are serving at higher ranks in your organization? So, we talked about the importance of asking questions and holding the government accountable, of allocating resources to make sure that we're not just making platitudes and broad statements, but we're actually supporting financially some of this work. We talked about when parliamentarians travel to other countries to really seek out opportunities to meet with women at community levels, with women led organizations, with those who are delivering services in communities that are really directly affected by war, about the importance of talking to them. Some of them have been or are really interested in passing legislation that actually codifies some of their own government's commitments to this work. So there's a whole range of ways at a national level that we need the support of, again, men and women parliamentarians. And then in the NATO context, they push NATO to have policies and to live up to its own commitments by asking questions, by providing input to make sure it's really reflective of their own constituents' priorities. And so those were a lot of the topics and themes that we talked about. And certainly there was a lot of resonance of the idea that our societies everywhere are are being divided and are being polarized, and that there are a lot of internal and external forces that benefit when we are more hostile to each other, when we don't truly listen to each other, when we can't have respectful dialogues. And a real focus was on both understanding the way that our societies are being divided, but then also opportunities to really bring people together for, again, a respectful conversation.
I'm glad that you brought in that national context because NATO as an alliance can ask the allies to do things, but it won't happen unless there's motivation that sits at the capital. And so when you were talking earlier about data collection and monitoring progress on women, peace, and security, I can't help but think about some of these initiatives that are going on at NATO. So, for instance, the NATO Committee on Gender Perspectives and the Office of the Gender Advisor within the International Military Staff, they collect this kind of data on the representation of women within their armed forces and some of the specific measures that they've implemented to increase the recruitment and participation of women in their national security forces, but also in the context of NATO operations. And the data is not available for every member state. So NATO can ask, it can push, prod, apply a bit of peer pressure. But at the end of the day, member states are going to do what they want to do. And even within the NATO context, when we think of NATO as a fairly homogenous group of states, there's quite a bit of difference when it comes to the enthusiasm for women, peace, and security. Nevertheless, there was a new policy that was adopted in July. So there is broad enough consensus for the agenda to have a fairly broad mandate. But of course, that mandate goes nowhere if there isn't strong national action plans guiding the individual member states.
Totally agree. And it's, I think, important to really drive that case. This is, again, just like the UN didn't create out of nowhere this agenda. NATO didn't come out of nowhere to define this as a priority area. It came from member states saying this is important to our effectiveness and our legitimacy as an organization to recognize and think about women, peace, and security. NATO's had a policy on this since 2007. Um, they've had a number of command directive, as you know well from your book, which we very much plug, Deploying Feminism. So NATO's had policy level areas of focus and policies, et cetera. But it was in 2022 that NATO released its strategic concept. And that strategic concept was the first time that women, peace, and security was pretty genuinely integrated across the various core tasks of NATO. So we're still in this area of progressing from being something that is separate and saying, yes, women are important. They're affected by conflict differently. We need them in our governments and our security forces, to actually saying, no, women are a core part of our defense and deterrence. We need them in our forces. We need full societal resistance. We need to have women, resisting slides into authoritarianism, recognizing early warning signs of conflict, responding to climate-related emergencies, preventing climate-related emergencies, and this core NATO task of cooperative security. We need to use this collaboration and interest that we have from many countries to build relationships strategically outside of NATO, in the southern flank, in the Indo-Pacific region, where there are areas of leadership and as you said, some national interest in various spaces to help NATO build and strengthen relationships outside of the alliance. And you mentioned, national action plans of NATO members. Every NATO member, save two, save Hungary and Turkey, has a national action plan on women, peace, and security. All of ours, they vary. None of us have national action plans that are fully implemented, uh, and but they do have national commitments. And so all of the different levers that we have for making sure that these commitments are reflected at national levels and that those are actually implemented helps NATO as well.
Good. Calling out Hungary and Turkey today. We'll turn to maybe that theme of the different actors involved in making women, peace, and security policies come together, both in the development of those policies. Sometimes they take the form of a national action plan, sometimes they're at an international level, but it's really and I want our listeners to realize this a community of practice made of government officials, members of the armed forces, civil society representatives, even academics, private sector, you name it. There's folks coming from different professional sectors who may have a common interest in women, peace, and security. And so I wanted to maybe use this as a way to transition to the work that you have done on Canada's National Action Plan because it involved multi-stakeholder, multi-partner consultations, fairly extensive ones. It took a long time for this national action plan to be unveiled. It was a slow process in a good way because this kind of consultation was essential, I think, for this broad-based engagement. So I wanted to ask about the lessons learned from this process, and then of course, consultation is important on the front end. So, in the lead up to the adoption, in this case, of a third national action plan. But what about the implementation phase? Kind of coming back to what you said at the outset, that there's a lot of implementation gaps. So, that's a very big question, but it's been such a big part of discussions on women, peace, and security in this country that we need to make some time for this.
Totally agree. It's one of my favorite topics as well as how we work as a broad community on this issue. The challenges that we're seeing don't have one or two or three single solutions. There's solutions and there's action needed across our entire society. So we need to be engaging people across our entire societies in both defining the issue and learning what we can from good practices and really having a vision for what Canada should be in the world. Um, We've been really intentional, as you mentioned, from the beginning of drafting our third national action plan, which I'll speak to. We certainly were in the first one, but constantly trying to learn lessons and actually apply them. So a couple of things. We actually contracted a civil society organization in Canada, Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada, to run national consultations to reach out to various groups and actors and say, what do you want to even see in Canada's next plan? What are the gaps in the previous one? What are your priorities? So they did that and they shared the information with us before we even began drafting. We tried to learn as much from other countries and civil society in other countries as well, not just in Canada, about what inputs they've said to their partners or their government partners. And then we had a really iterative process of drafting the plan. So we had what we call the reading group, where we actually got special permission from our ministers, that political offices, to share early drafts of our plan with readers, some from, primarily from civil society, also, as you mentioned, from academia, from veterans. We have a number of women veterans who are active and really emphasizing the importance of women veterans shaping this agenda too. And so they saw early drafts. They were able to give us input and feedback. Something that's really special about Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security is that we actually have a structured role for our civil society partners. We have an advisory group that's described in the action plan itself, and it's co-chaired by the government and the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada. And what that means is we have predictable engagement points. We have predictable conversations. We have an established relationship where they can tell us within government. We don't understand why you're doing the following. This doesn't make sense. This is not consistent with what you've said in this other area here. We're not seeing reporting on this in a timely way. We're not getting what we need to know about whatever. And then we can also say, here's some of the issues that we're dealing with. What are your experiences? What do you think needs to be a priority, et cetera? And as you said, it takes time. It does sometimes make for a much slower process. We could have, probably at this point got artificial intelligence, some chatbot to generate a reasonable national action plan for us. But we really needed to ensure that civil society in Canada in particular was able to shape some priorities. And I'll share just a couple quick things that we heard and that are reflected in the plan. One was we heard really clearly that when the government has a long planning horizon, when we're planning a program or some kind of other initiative that's got a more limited or specific set of goals, we do a pretty good job of integrating attention to gender and thinking about women, peace, and security. But when crisis hits, we don't always have the reflexes uh, built into our processes. We don't always collect information that's disaggregated by gender. We don't always think immediately about what are opportunities to lift up women in civil society's voices in a negotiating process. We have the intention to, but we don't necessarily always do it. We don't have the systems in place to help us do it. And because there's often a lot of cross-departmental collaboration involved in crises, evacuations, emergency response, we have to make sure that together we are ready and wanting to do this work. And so we introduced a focus on crisis response and are trying to get much sharper and better at doing that. The other thing we heard really clearly from civil society is that our reporting every year just is not useful. We collect way too many indicators. Way too many of them are quantitative, but don't actually tell us information. So we're counting how many people showed up to a meeting or a training, or how many workshops occurred, or how many people were at a specific high level meeting. And they said that that's not telling the government information. It's not helping us hold you accountable. We weren't sharing year over year data changes because they were changing so much, like the composition of the indicator was changing so much. So we totally changed our approach to reporting. We have way fewer indicators now. We still report annually to Parliament, but we're incorporating many more indicators that include qualitative data, that include stories of impact and change, and that track things that actually tell us whether things are progressing or not. Which was, I know, the second part of your question. Um, we're seeing important changes in terms of the way that I would say that one of the biggest changes we're seeing is going higher and higher, earlier and earlier in processes, uh, thinking about integrating attention to women, peace, and security. So when we're analyzing risk or conflict drivers in a country, we're more systematically talking about, is gender inequality a driver? What have historically been the role of women in mediating conflict in this community? What opportunities are there for Canada to support local women in communities? Um, when we're planning, evacuation missions or other kinds of operations, going earlier and earlier in the planning stages is one of the areas. We're also tracking, and we'll have reporting when we release it publicly on how much we're actually supporting women peace builders in different communities, and is that proportion going up or down?
Okay, that's really interesting in terms of talking about progress and change and how you measure it beyond the quantitative indicators that were previously in the annual reports. So, would you mind going into some of the ways that you leverage this qualitative data to showcase change? I'm interested because as you mentioned before, my research is focused on women, peace, and security in the NATO context, and the first responders in a lot of military operations are the military, right? They're trying to create that secure environments for stability to take hold. And so, when you're talking to military actors, they sometimes think in terms of a 6 month rotation and what we can accomplish, and they have certain indicators that kind of fit that time frame. And for women, peace and security, we have to push also for the long term. So how do you reconcile that, the need to show progress in the time frame of an annual report, which is, not 6 months, but still a short period of time, but still show that, we're having a major positive impact on the ground?
Well, that's the crux of it, is how do we show progress without having to show or put people in a position where they're trying to, in effect, create really specific results in an artificially short timeline. So partly we have to, it goes into the picking of the indicators that we use. So if, the only way we're measuring progress in a country is whether a specific piece of legislation is passed or not, that's going to lead us to think either nothing's happening or, everything is perfect because they changed inheritance law and women can now inherit property and go from there. So thinking about much better indicators, and sometimes those indicators are things like who's actually showing up to meetings, topics discussed at meetings that were never raised before. Um, who is raising those topics? So is it constantly, a junior level employee who gets sent to a meeting about a specific security issue and raises a dimension related to women? Or are we noting that it's in the defense minister's speeches at 5 different occasions? These are things that are not always, super compelling to hear as points, but they do add up to a lot of meaningful progress. And so we have to give space for, and what this part of what we've done is give space for our embassies, for example, to tell us what they think is the most meaningful indicator of progress towards something versus headquarters saying, tell us the number of this or the number of that. And so we're going to incorporate that much more into our annual and public reporting.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I want to now ask a question about the broader security environment we're in right now. It definitely feels more tumultuous, increasingly so, one might argue, with great power competition, tough bilateral relations with the US on the horizon, and war in Ukraine, in the Middle East. Every region has its own challenges, but definitely we want to make sure that we articulate the connection between women, peace, and security as a group of norms, once again, and these broader security concerns. So I was wondering if you had some insights on that front.
So, as I was saying at the beginning, trying to be as specific as we can when talking about different issues and why it is important to think about women, peace, and security is a dimension that will help us with all of the above, I think. Thinking about what are big pressing security concerns generally, everywhere in the world, climate comes up as one of people's top concerns as a real threat to security. And I don't think it's widely understood by all of us as policymakers, the connection between climate security and women in particular. And I think we need to unpack that. And that this is a concern, of course, to Canadians as well. And for example, I'll describe what I mean. Everywhere in the world, women are more likely than men to be poor. People who are poor have less ability to adapt to a changing climate. So to either move to higher ground, to replant different seeds that will thrive under a different types of conditions, to buy an air conditioner, to buy insulation. They have fewer resources to be able to adapt to climate change. Climate change also generates migration, mass movement of people, either temporarily or permanently. We know when there is mass migration, women tend to be particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation, to human trafficking, sometimes to recruitment into armed groups or other forces. They tend to be responsible for caring for children during migration periods and therefore have different resource needs. So, unpacking, for example, the different ways that different people experience climate change and climate emergencies is an important aspect. Equally important is recognizing that in this case, while women have some areas where they're disproportionately impacted by climate change, they're also very much underrepresented in developing strategies to adapt to climate change. Indigenous women, in particular, are really uniquely positioned, including in Canada, to help us think through responsible resource management, being climate resilient, the impacts of climate change on security and relationships between communities. And they, among many other women, are underrepresented in some of these structures. And so we have to part of what we're trying to do then is not just say women are disproportionately impacted by climate or poses a specific threat, but really unpack what specifically that means.
And you mentioned poverty earlier. So again, thinking back to some academic literature on these themes, countries that have higher levels of gender inequality are poorer and more violent. So it seems everyone is disadvantaged from gender inequality within their societies and can't really solve the international security equation without women, peace, and security.
It's one of my favorite stats of all time is that the single biggest predictor of whether a country will go to war with itself or with its neighbors is not its gross domestic product, its neighborhood in the world, its dominant religion. It's whether women have access to their rights in that country.
We'll find some way to put this on a t-shirt, I think, because the most compelling tidbits that nations that fail women fail, period.
I'll buy it.
I'm a, I'm a professor, so you will see why my last question is my favorite question. Do you have any advice for the next generation? So I see lots of enthusiasm for women, peace, and security here at Queen's, for instance. And so, for anyone looking to study women, peace, and security or to get into that field, what would you provide in terms of your recommendations?
I don't know if it's just me, but I'm feeling it at a state in the world where I wouldn't even dare give anyone advice in a younger generation. I say just do what you think needs to be done. I was at a workshop a couple days ago, and someone was talking about the phrase diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being invited to dance. I thought, okay, that's good. I've heard that a lot, and then I thought so many young people that I get to work with are just turning that on their head. They're saying, I don't want to be invited, wait to be invited to a party. I don't want to be invited to dance. I want to throw a party. I want to pick my own music. I want to choose the date of the party. And who are these people controlling the invitations to dancing and parties overall? And what credibility do they have? I'm not all for throwing it all out, but I see young people organizing in ways that are necessary and that address some of the gaps that we have. So a lot of the movements and work by young people on peace and security are more inclusive than they have historically been. They've got more authentic allies among men, among LGBTQ plus communities. They're reaching out to people in different spaces to do this work. They're focusing on, they can mobilize quickly. They're not forming organizations that have charters and even email accounts, et cetera, but they're flexible and responsive. And so the best career advice that I ever got was to focus on the difference that you want to make, not the position or job that you want to have. And I think if young people keep focusing on that, keep focusing on the difference that they want to make, and then figuring out how to do that in their own way and not just copy a lot of the processes and structures that have gotten us to many of these challenges in the first place, we'll be in a lot better shape.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. I've enjoyed our exchange so much, Ambassador O'Neill. Thank you for being a guest on the podcast.
thank you for all of your work and leadership in this space. And thanks to the CDA Institute for its focus on women, peace, and security as a really core security issue for Canada and the world.
I agree. On this, take care.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. Your feedback helps us bring you content that's relevant and engaging. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to our guest, Stéfanie von Hlatky, who took on hosting duties for this episode, and Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill. Until next time.